Hello and welcome. Today we have an audience that ranges from East Asia, Europe and Russia, and the entire United States from coast to coast. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on your location. I'm George Beebe. I am the Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. Today's event is one that we are co-sponsoring with Harvard's Belfer Center through its Russia Matters project and through the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. I want to thank Simone Sarajian of Harvard's Russia Matters project for help in organizing today's event. And I want to introduce and thank Melinda Herring of the Atlantic Council for her efforts to make today's event possible through the Zoom teleconferencing application. Melinda.
Thanks, George. We're delighted to team up with you all again. We had a debate last month and we're looking forward to doing more with you in the future as well. So we're very, very excited to have more than 300 people here for this debate. Looking forward to an energetic performance from all of you. I read Dr. Allison's article this morning in Foreign Affairs, and I really commend it. If you haven't had a chance to read it, read the whole thing in depth. And I also want to invite our audience to an event that we're hosting tomorrow on Ukraine's foreign policy at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So be sure to have a look at the Atlantic Council website. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back over to George. We're delighted to work with you, and we look forward to this debate. Thank you.
Thanks, Melinda, and we look forward to more events with the Atlantic Council ourselves. So our event today is about spheres of influence. And this is a topic that until recently was considered a settled matter in the United States. And it's an issue that all post-Cold War American presidencies strongly opposed as what they called a dangerous relic of the past. And I want to read for you all just a few quotations from our past presidencies to illustrate what the consensus view has been. So after Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice declared that the United States would, quote, resist any Russian attempt to consign sovereign nations and free people to some archaic sphere of influence. Then after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, President Barack Obama warned Moscow, quote, the days of empire and spheres of influence are over. Bigger nations must not be allowed to bully the small or impose their will at the barrel of a gun. Then he also went on to warn China that the security order in East Asia could never be based on, quote, spheres of influence or coercion or intimidation. And President Trump's administration has essentially carried on this same approach. In the White House National Security Strategy published in 2017, it specifically opposes China's efforts to, quote, reorder the Indo-Pacific region in its favor, and it denounces Russia's bid, quote, to restore its great power status and establish spheres of influence near its borders. This old consensus is increasingly being challenged, and we have the good fortune to have two of the prominent challengers here with us today on our online panel. One is Dr. Graham Allison of Harvard University, who, as Melinda pointed out, recently published an article in Foreign Affairs challenging this consensus and arguing that the US no longer has the power unilaterally to prevent spheres of influence altogether, and that we're going to have to approach this much more pragmatically. Then Paul Saunders, a senior fellow at the Center for the National Interest, joined this argument in an article he published on the Russia Matters site, arguing essentially the same thing, that we're going to have to look at this a lot more pragmatically and realistically than we have. What I will call the consensus view is not without its continuing support. And we have two of those people here on our panel as well, both former US ambassadors to Ukraine, Steve Pifer of the Brookings Institution and Stanford University, actually debated Paul Saunders on the Russia Matters site, and John Herbst of the Eurasia Center and Atlantic Council is also someone who challenges these new challengers. So I hope we're in for a very lively discussion today. So how this is going to work is I'm going to give each of these panelists about 5 minutes for opening remarks. And then I'm going to give each of them an opportunity, should they choose, to react to what the other panelists have said. And then after that, I'm going to open this whole discussion up to the audience for questions and answers. So we're going to begin with Graham Allison. Graham, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm honored to participate with such distinguished panelists. I had a good fortune to work with one in the Clinton administration and to admire the work of the other as an ambassador to Ukraine, and Paul I've known at the Center for National Interest. So this is an opportunity for me, and I also thank the Center for National Interest for its, I think, broad attitude in reaching out to an article in the Competitors magazine and recognizing it. So let me start with two big bottom lines up front. So if this is, as everyone says, a new era of great power competition, what does that mean? What does that imply for America's role in the world? 2 points. First, discombobulation, disorientation, confusion, discovery that the presumptions and convictions that we previously held in a previous era no longer hold, that things we thought or said are no longer correct. If I could stretch, maybe even a dose of humility as we recognize that we don't quite know what's going on. So I say to myself and to others, if you're not slightly confused about what's happening, you probably haven't started to begin understanding the problem. And I think, therefore, engaging in what we think, even when we're wrong, is appropriate. And that's actually the purpose of this article, to provoke discussion, to have us help rethink some of the verities that we've been holding to. Second point, if the US is no longer a unipolar power, and we recognize that China and Russia are serious great powers in themselves, that perforce says the US is less powerful than we were before, or than we thought we were. So an axiom of strategy says diminished means can only achieve diminished ends. However much we may not like it, diminished means can only achieve diminished ends. So let me make 4 points quickly. First, I think in trying to think about this, we have to start with the structural realities, the tectonics. And most people still don't get it, in my view. I give my students a quiz. I say, tell me what percentage of the world's GDP was the US in 1950, at the end of the Cold War in 1991, and today. Remember three numbers: 50%, 25%, and 1/7. So let me say it again. We were half of the world's GDP in 1950. We were a quarter of the world's GDP into the Cold War. We're about 1/7 of the world's GDP today. Let me give you two more numbers. So in 1991, China's GDP was about a quarter, less than a quarter of that of the US. Today, 120%. That's by purchasing power parity, which is the yardstick that CIA believes is the best metric for comparing national economies. Go to the CIA website and look at it. China is a larger economy than the US today. In terms of defense spending, China's defense spending was 1/25 of the US, again, that's a quarter century ago. Today, about a third. And if you were to put that in purchasing power parity, more. So start with the structural tectonics. Second point, recognize the illusions and delusions of the unipolar era. I challenge anyone to read the lines that we both read and said and believed in 1991, 92, 93 without smiling. So the principal thesis of the era was Frank Fukuyama's End of History. He argued that we had now come to the end of ideological debates. Democracies in market economies were going to be the future for everybody. And Tom Friedman extended that further with his famous "The world is flat," and the McDonald's theory of peace. You can go read it, but you can't read it without smiling. It says that two nations that have golden arches cannot go to war with each other because people will be standing in line to buy hamburgers and not prepared to fight. Okay? So I would say recognize the illusions. Third, remember history. So for several thousand years, great powers have exercised great power. This is almost a tautology. So great powers have used their great power to assert their interests and values, and in particular to do so along their borders and in adjacent seas, where they have demanded a degree of deference. That was true for Athens and Sparta. Thucydides has a good account of it. That was true for every other great power in history. So number 4, I would say we should therefore dust off some of the concepts that were developed over centuries of statescraft to try to help us get ourselves oriented in this new world. And 4 of those that I discuss in the article are balances of power, spheres of influence, alliances, and maybe even this ancient concept called diplomacy, of which both Steve and John are great practitioners. So in terms of balances of power, if one state has a substantially disproportionate power relative to its neighbor, that casts a shadow that allows the more powerful to coerce the less powerful. That's a simple fact. And I take it that that fact has been recognized by every American president since World War II. So when each of those presidents has had an opportunity to stand up for freedom on behalf of freedom fighters or some other state that was in the sphere of influence of another state, they have said yet. Eisenhower when the Hungarians rose up in 56, Johnson in 68 for Czech Prague Spring, Obama for Georgia when the choice was let Russia crush Georgia and separate 2 territories or come to their defense. And currently, that was Bush, Bush 43, and then Obama when Russia took a bite of Ukraine and Crimea. So in each one of those occasions, there were voices in the US government that said, we can't let these people stand alone. We can't simply encourage them and condemn or even just sanctions. We should fight on their behalf. And in every instance, presidents looked at the matter and said, we're not going to fight for the freedom of these states or these people because we risk a war with a great power that could end up being a war with us. And in a world in which other states have nuclear superpower arsenals, that could cause us to disappear. So I think that's just a simple, hard fact. So to conclude, the article says, time for reassessment, reflection, judgment, basically, I think a reckoning and a realignment of some of the things that we said and some of the commitments that we made. So this will, I predict, be a harsher, crueler world, unfortunately, and we shouldn't be happy about that. But I would say that's life as far as I can see.
All right, Grant, thank you very much. I think you've gotten us off to a wonderful and provocative start. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Steve Pifer for his perspective on this topic.
Well, thank you, George. Let me also thank the Atlantic Council, the Center for the National Interest, and Russia Matters for organizing this discussion. I'm going to focus my comments really on Russia, which is my lane of expertise. And I'll begin by saying that it's very clear that the Kremlin is very interested in a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. And by that, what the Kremlin wants is for countries such as Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, to defer to Moscow on issues that the Kremlin deems important for Russian interests, regardless of the interests or desires of those countries. And it seems to me this goes a little bit beyond just influence. This is actually Russia trying to assert a measure of control in those neighbors. Now, just because the Russians want a sphere of influence, that does not mean that the United States should accept that. Accepting a Russian sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space would basically be to deny countries such as Ukraine agency. It would be to deny them the right to develop their own foreign and domestic policy courses. And we would be accepting a situation in which small countries would be expected to sacrifice their interests to the preferences of larger, more powerful neighbors, regardless of whether those preferences were legitimate or illegitimate. And I'd make one additional point too, is that accepting the Russian sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space would also lead to a sense, both in countries such as Poland and the Baltic states, American allies, a sense of greatly reduced security, because they would then find themselves bordering that sphere of influence, and they would legitimately ask the question, do we know that Russian ambitions really stop at the old Soviet border? Now, Moscow's desire to have a sphere of influence is intense, so intense that I believe Moscow would be perfectly prepared to concede to the United States a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere in return. That's not a trade that's in the American interest. And it really turns on the question of how do countries such as the United States and Russia pursue influence? Though it's diminished in the past several years, particularly under the Trump administration, US influence derives from a power of attraction based on American ideals, the American economy, and soft power. And also, countries conclude it's in their security interests to align with the United States. But to the extent that the United States has influence in Western Hemisphere, in Europe or elsewhere, that really is a reflection of that power of attraction. Now, I'm not going to argue that the American interest here is entirely altruistic. Certainly, the United States derives benefits from that influence. And I'm also not going to defend every instance of American policy. I would argue, for example, that US policy towards Cuba has been misguided and is a 50-year failure. But if you compare how the United States pursues influence and how Russia pursues influence, you're going to see a very big difference. The Russian model does not entail much power of attraction. Russia does not have a great deal of soft power. And so when you look at the institutions that Moscow has tried to create in the post-Soviet space, such as the Collective Security Treaty Organization or the Eurasia Economic Union, you're not seeing a great deal of interest and enthusiasm on the parts of countries in the post-Soviet space to join those organizations. And so instead, the Kremlin has to resort to other techniques to advance its influence. And we've seen that over the past 30 years in Ukraine. You've seen Russia exploiting ethnic Russians for political subversion purposes, Russian economic pressure denying, for example, Ukrainian free trade benefits. You saw energy pressure. So in 2006 and 2009, Russia cut off the flow of natural gas to Ukraine. You've seen cyber conflict against Ukraine. And over the last 6 years, you've seen Russian proxy forces and also regular units of the Russian army seizing Crimea and then provoking and sustaining a conflict in Donbass, which has now claimed some 14,000 lives. I would argue that's not the best way for Russia to be building influence. Let me also say that this is not to deny that Russia has legitimate interests with regards to its neighbors. It does, that's natural. But it gets to the question, how does Russia pursue those interests? If Russia sought to build a sphere of influence or influence based on its power of attraction, on soft power, there would be no reason to object. And if other countries, if Georgia, Belarus decided to align with Russia because they concluded it's in their interest, again, there's no reason to object. Where the objection comes in is when Russia tries to force countries to align with Russia against those countries' own calculation of what is in or is not in their interest. Finally, let me just note that I think accepting the Kremlin's effort to build a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space ultimately would be to the detriment of Russia. Because the longer the Russians pursue this kind of effort, what they're going to find is they're going to further alienate their neighbors. Nothing has done more than Vladimir Putin's policy towards Ukraine over the past 6 years to consolidate a Ukrainian sense of national identity, to push Ukraine away from Russia, and to push Ukraine towards the West. And the longer the Russians pursue such a policy, what they're going to find is they have greater and greater problems in their relationships with their neighbors. So to be sure, I think Graham's right. The United States is in a situation where we're going to have to contend with Russia's efforts to assert great power rights, and we're going to have to contend with Russia's effort to build a sphere of influence, but that does not mean that the United States should accept the legitimacy of those efforts. Thanks.
Very good, Steve. I think our differences in perspective are starting to come into sharper focus. Paul Saunders. Well, I think you might be muted.
Thank you, George, and thank you, of course, to the Center for the National Interest, to Russia Matters, to the Atlantic Council. Really delighted to be here with all of you today. I'm going to try to make 5 points very quickly, and if I have enough time after doing that, I'll perhaps respond a little bit to some of the things that Steve said, or we can let that wait until later. And like Graham, I really want to go back to the fundamentals because I think the fundamentals are important. So first, I would argue that there are places in the world where America's rivals, whether that's Russia or China or someone else, have greater capabilities and greater interests than the United States. I think that's a fact. If we want to debate that, certainly welcome to welcome that conversation. Point number 2. I think because these areas exist, it's kind of difficult for the United States to make policy that advances our own interests in those places. We found that very challenging, actually, because of a combination of their power, their commitment, our limitations, and in some cases even our self-imposed constraints. Thirdly, to the extent that we want to do better and have good American policy, we need to be kind of honest with ourselves and realistic about the world that we face. We need to understand actually that there are cases in international affairs when we don't have good options and we have to choose the least bad option actually among our choices. That gets me to my 4th point, and here I'm kind of aligning very much with Graham. We have a lot more thinking to do about how to come up with effective policies to deal with these problems. I would argue that our policy toward Georgia leading up to and following the events of August 2008 has not been that successful. I would argue that our policy toward Ukraine leading up to and following February, March 2014 has not been very successful. And since those 2 policies haven't been very successful, I think we need to re-examine some of our assumptions, re-examine the choices and decisions and analysis that led us to make the decisions that we made throughout a long period of time, and try to decide how to do better. Finally, I think we need to have a name for these regions of the world where we have to contend with our rivals' capabilities and interests. In the past, people called that a sphere of influence. I'm not wedded to the name sphere of influence. It's clearly something that has a lot of negative historical connotations. It's not certainly not a kind of a way of doing business that I would want to advocate. But we have to call it something. It can be gray zones. It can be something else. But if we want to have a robust discussion about what to do, we need a name. Finally, and this here, I'll just respond very narrowly to Steve on one point. I'm not talking here about the United States government, the State Department, the White House issuing a press release saying that we have decided that spheres of influence exist and the following countries, belong to someone else's sphere of influence, and this other list belongs to the United States. I think that would be actually extremely counterproductive. I think that there's no question about that. You don't want certainly to tell other countries that they're part of someone else's sphere of influence. It's not an appropriate direction for US policy to go in. But we do need to be honest with ourselves when we have internal debates in the United States, in our public policy institutions, within the US government, and in other fora. We have to recognize that these challenges exist. We have to recognize that our policies in the past have not succeeded. We have to recognize that we have limitations, and we have to try to find a way to do better. Let me stop there. 6 minutes, sorry.
George, you're muted.
Great. Excellent job staying more or less to the time limit, Paul. Now I turn to John Herbst.
Okay, thank you, George. I'd like to thank Graham and Paul for performing a real service in talking about the importance of understanding the real world as it operates, understanding that spheres of influence exist, that we're in a great competition we're in a competition with great powers, and that means and ends must be in sync in order to have a successful foreign policy. And I'm willing to concede all these things up front. But when it comes to the application of these concepts, I think Steve has it right. And I think that Paul and Graham are on the wrong side of things. We are in a great power competition with China and with Russia. And there's no question that their values and their interests as they currently define them cut against American interests and the interests of our allies. And in a period of great power competition, it behooves us to try as best we can to weaken our adversaries. And the way to do that is to minimize the spheres of influence that they will try and with some success create. And that's the important point to start. But then there's the analytical point as well. Paul and Graham are operating at 30,000 feet, and they're focusing essentially on just great powers. And certainly any foreign policy realist needs to understand what the great powers are up to, their capabilities and their intentions. But to look at any specific foreign policy problem, you have to come down from 30,000 feet and get your hands and your feet in the mud to understand the local realities. And when you do that, you recognize that great powers are not always destined to project their influence in their neighborhood. Graham came up with a number of historical examples where the United States decided not to challenge a great power, principally the Soviet Union, when the Soviets repressed Czechoslovakia, Hungary in 68 and 56, and of course in Georgia when Russia did the same with Georgia. And we also did not intervene militarily in Ukraine. But there are other instances when we struck back against great powers in working in their neighborhood. If we didn't, we would not have gone into South Korea in 1950 and stopped an aggression that would have taken over the whole peninsula. And it's worth recognizing too, and again, any realist will understand this, that great powers are not always going to win in conflicts with their neighbors. Again, the Soviet Union learned that in Korea, but even without great power intervention, the Chinese learned that in Vietnam in 1979, and Russia is learning that right now in Ukraine. The United States is providing substantial support, but it is not sending military assistance. We have a vital interest in helping Ukraine win. Not that we would use our soldiers. We have a great interest in helping Ukraine win because Russia's intentions are hostile to us. We are lucky that we had the sense in the 1990s to oversee the expansion of NATO. Not that we pushed it, as Steve Pifer correctly points out, the countries that joined NATO wanted to join and we said yes. Because if we had not expanded NATO in the 1990s, Moscow's current war in Donbass might be fought along the Vistula. It's worth recalling, since we're talking about history, that Russia took control of Eastern Poland at the same time it seized Crimea in the late 18th century. And it's important to understand that Mr. Putin's objectives are hostile to NATO, to the transatlantic relationship, to the EU. And any realist understands that you give Putin troubles in Donbass, you're far less likely to have troubles with Mr. Putin in the Baltics, or in Romania, or in Poland. And the same is true, of course, with China. China gave up its quote unquote peaceful rise in the wake of the Great Recession and began to push on an expansionist course in the East and the South China Seas, greatly upsetting its neighbors. Just as it is our interest to support Ukraine, it's also in our interest to work with Japan and India and Australia and ASEAN to limit China's aggressive outreach in Southeast Asia and in the seas around it. That is very much an American national interest. And I almost see a nostalgia on the part of Paul and Graham for the sphere of influence that the Soviet Union exercised. Let's remember.
I reject that. I'm sorry, John.
That's why I said almost, but hear me out. You'll have a chance to respond later. That sphere of influence was when Moscow was at its absolute historical apogee. They could control that part of the world because the Red Army was there at the end of World War II when we wanted the Soviet Union to help us with Japan. But Russia is much weaker today than the Soviet Union ever was. And Russia is in fact a declining power because unlike China, it does not have a world-class economy. And again, it's in our interest to push back. And any realist recognizing American interests, American values, and the power of local powers like Ukraine, like Vietnam, will seek to work with them to limit the outreach of both Moscow and Beijing. That's the true realist policy of an American, and a sustainable one. Thank you.
All right, very good. So my would have some sharp differences of opinion has already been realized. I want to give every panelist an opportunity to react to what's been said so far. I see Graham has his hands up, so I'll start with him.
Okay, so thank you very much. Excellent points by both John and Steve. And we could take each one and wrestle with it for a long time. Let me just try to be brief in responses. So first, I think I appreciate that John agrees with the essential conceptual analysis and that there are spheres of influence. The question is whether we should contend with other states in those spheres of influence. And I agree with that completely. My proposition is not that we should simply accept and ignore. It is that we're not going to fight over Ukraine, and we shouldn't. And those who propose that we should or did would have been mistaken, I believe. We didn't fight over Hungary. That was a debate. I think that was the right choice. We didn't fight over Georgia. I believe that was the right choice. So the reality that other states will be able to use hard power to their advantage doesn't mean the end of the game. I think this is a long-term competition and all instruments are in order, but that's the first proposition. So I'm not endorsing what Russia's doing. I'm not endorsing what China's doing. I don't like that. I would like to resist it, but I would say there's some realities, and the realities that where they have military power to exert their influence, as they have done, that we cannot deny that. So indeed, I would even be more provocative and say the attempt, this gets to both John's and Steve's point, and I don't want to misstate this, but I would say we should ask ourselves, what were the consequences of Americans and Europeans' illusions about the denial of spheres of influence that can be defended by military means? What were the consequences of those actions, first in the case of Georgia, and second in the case of Ukraine? And when I read that story, I cannot understand Russia's action, and I think nobody would have expected or predicted. And I think actually Russia's actions, or Georgia's actions, wouldn't have been Georgia's actions without the Bush administration's mistaken encouragement of Georgia to become on the admissions list for NATO. And similarly, I don't think we would have seen what we saw in Ukraine had the Western Europeans, with some American support, not misplayed our hand badly in the case that Ukraine was sliding towards first EU and then towards NATO. But that's a debate we could have in itself. Finally, let me say about Steve's points. I think that it would be fine to declare a world in which great powers only compete with soft power. So one could say that, but I would say I predict that will be put into the list of illusions and delusions. So this is like declaring the end of history to great powers' use of hard power. We can say they shouldn't use hard power. We would like for them to compete in that way, but I would say states in history have always exercised hard power. China and Russia will be exercising hard power. The reason why the realities in Syria today are what they are, ugly as they are, is that Russia was prepared to exercise hard power. So I would say that's the overwhelming reality. We don't have to like it. We don't have to agree with it. We can condemn it, but I would say we have to live with it.
All right, Steve Pifer.
Yeah, let me make one response to Graham, then a couple responses to Paul's points. I mean, first, Graham, I'm not ignoring hard power, but what I'm saying is there's a very real difference between a country that tries to build a sphere of influence or build its influence on using soft power or hard power. Going to Paul's points, Paul, okay, I hear what you're saying about, you're saying that the United States government should not come out and say, we accept a sphere of influence. That's fine. But I think if you look at what you've suggested, though, over the course of your intervention, that would certainly be seen by most of the world as the United States accepting a sphere of influence, even if the United States government did not publicly say it. The second point, I agree with you that countries will have an asymmetry of interests, and that Russia may care more than the United States does about Ukraine. But you're leaving out a third party, which is the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians care most of all about their foreign policy course and their domestic policy course. And basically by conceding or accepting the Russian sphere of influence, you're telling Ukraine, those rights somehow matter less than our concern about Russia. And then finally, a point that I disagree is, I would not call American policy towards Ukraine a failure. If you go back, and Graham may recall this, but back in the Clinton administration, we said, what does the United States want to see in Ukraine? A country that would be in the American interest. It was an independent, democratic, stable state with a growing market economy, increased links with the West, and good relations with Russia. Now, you can't check every one of those boxes, but you can say that Ukraine is independent. You can say that Ukraine is democratic, and Ukraine is making progress on some of those other issues. And again, I think it would be a very different Ukraine if we simply said we're washing our hands of it, and Ukraine is basically, should go back into the Russian orbit.
Okay. Paul, do you have a response?
Yeah, I sure do, as you might imagine. I mean, I guess maybe responding first to Steve and then some other points. So first of all, on our policy toward Ukraine, I certainly wouldn't argue that it's failed in every respect. But we have a situation now in which Russia is occupying Crimea and is likely to do so indefinitely. The United States does not have a realistic policy to change that in any kind of politically meaningful time frame. And there's a very tragic conflict underway in eastern Ukraine that's created millions of refugees and a lot of physical destruction, more than 10,000 people dead, and all kinds of other problems for Ukraine. I don't think we can really separate that reality from the choices that we've made during this time period. John mentioned Korea and our intervention in Korea. As I recall, the Korean War, actually, we intervened in Korea, of course, and I think that was a good decision. But the way I remember my history, the US and United Nations forces started moving closer and closer toward the Chinese border. And then China intervened in that conflict in a very substantial way, driving our forces back, prolonging that conflict, and ultimately producing a divided Korea. So to my mind, actually, that's a case that kind of strengthens the argument that powers have important interests in their neighborhood, and that there can be costs associated with not taking that into account adequately. Let me just also say there's a case actually that John, you didn't mention, of the United States standing up to the Soviets in their neighborhood, which is Afghanistan. And I have to say, on balance, I think that was the right decision. But I think it would also be kind of a mistake for us, decades later, not to acknowledge that there were some other consequences of that choice for the United States, because the allies who we had to align ourselves with in order to do that, ultimately became a really big problem for America on September 11th. So I think the issue here is not, should we or should we not confront great powers that are rivals of the United States. We should. I think that's very clear. When we're in great power competition, we have to compete. We shouldn't unilaterally disarm. I think the discussion that we need to have is how do we do this effectively? And doing it effectively, first and foremost, requires understanding, as I think both Graham and I have tried to argue, what our own limitations are. And what some of the unintended or second order consequences of our choices might be. And trying to factor those in advance so that we don't overextend ourselves, so that we don't get into situations, and Graham mentioned 1956, where Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, I guess it was just Radio Free Europe at that time, I think was kind of encouraging people in Hungary to believe that the United States was there to support them, encouraging a rebellion that Eisenhower was never going to intervene to support. And for anyone who wants American policy not only to be effective, but also to be moral, I think it's profoundly immoral to encourage allies and partners to think that they will get more support from us than they're actually really likely to get when the chips are down. So I believe fully in living up to every commitment that the United States makes. But because I believe that, I also believe in making those commitments very carefully. And I think that's what we need to be talking about here. Sorry for the long comment.
Great, Paul, and thank you for introducing the question of morality into this at this point in the debate, because I'm sure that will provoke a response.
I imagine so.
John, do you have anything that you'd like to say on any of the points made so far?
Okay, one specific, then one larger point. The specific point concerns Korea. My point was that if we intervened in 1950, South Korea would have been gobbled up. Paul's right on the mistake of we tried to cross the DMZ. That was a serious mistake, and I certainly disagree with it. It was a bad decision. But it's also worth making another point here. The reason why you had the initial invasion of South Korea was because we were recognizing, in effect, the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, if not communist China, when Dean Acheson gave his famous speech in the early 1950s when he kept South Korea outside of our defense perimeter. That was a case where our acknowledgement of spheres of influence led to war. Very serious mistake. Now, my broader point is this. Both Paul and Graham seem to think that somehow American policy was responsible for the Russian invasion of Georgia and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Nonsense. Here's the point. Yes, we talked about Ukraine and Georgia being part of NATO. That was part of the Bucharest summit, NATO summit in 2008. But that summit in no way endorsed the concept of them joining in anywhere in the near future. There was a vague talk about them having the right to join in the future. Everyone knew that that was not going to happen in decades, if at all. Russia was intervening in Georgia in the 1990s. Russia's policy near abroad, the overt intervention, preceded any American policy. Russia chose to aggress against Ukraine because Ukraine was going to create a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU. We weren't talking about Ukraine becoming part of NATO. We weren't talking about Ukraine becoming part of the EU. Russia was insisting that Ukraine be open to the Eurasian Economic Union. Now, last point. American policy in Ukraine has been a success. Steve outlined why. The policy that's truly failed in Ukraine is Putin's. Putin was the most popular politician in Ukraine when I was ambassador there in the early 2000s. As a result of Kremlin intervention in Ukraine during the Orange Revolution, Putin no longer was the most popular politician in Ukraine. As a result of Putin's aggression in Ukraine, you have a strong sense of nationalism in Ukraine, which is oriented westward. The Russian economy is losing 1% or more a year because of Western sanctions because of their war in Ukraine. Russia is effectively bogged down in Donbass. When a major foe of the United States or adversary of the United States is bogged down, his economy is hurting because of their failed foreign policy. That is a policy success for us. But it only is a policy success for us because the Ukrainian people want to fight for their own territorial integrity. And they have that right, and we should support them short of war.
All right, excellent. Thank you all for your opening remarks and responses. We have a limited amount of time available to us, and I want to provide for some questions from our audience. And I want to start out with one from Bill Courtney, another former US ambassador, who asks, if the US were to make clear that Ukraine and Georgia could never become NATO members, what is the likelihood that this might cause Russia to withdraw its forces from the Donbass, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia? Any responses?
Well, I would note that Ambassador Courtney did not mention the question of Crimea, but it seems to me that in fact, you know, even if the American government said we're not going to push this and take it off the table, I don't think that solves the problem with Russia, because as John pointed out, in 2013, when the Russians began to put pressure on Ukraine, and then when they seized Crimea, this was not about Ukraine's relationship with NATO. Viktor Yanukovych had made clear back in 2010 that he wanted a good relation with NATO, but he didn't want to join it. He didn't want a membership action plan. The Russians pressed Ukraine, not because of NATO, because of Ukraine's desire that was supported by a large portion of the population to sign a comprehensive free trade arrangement with the European Union. So I don't think that the United States and NATO swearing off of Ukraine and Georgia changes that calculation in Moscow. The Russians are still going to be using their various devices to build that sphere of influence.
Can I disagree?
No, Graham, you have to agree.
Okay. So I don't know the details of this story as well as you and John do, since you were in the middle of it. But I certainly know the Russian side of this story and have watched this. I think at this stage, to Bill Courtney's question, I think it's probably too late to go back and unscramble this omelet. But I wish we had taken that action before. And it seems to me that for anybody to have watched the US government in the run-up to the Budapest summit, and all of the efforts it made. And then the conclusion of the summit in 2008, as John rightly said, is Georgia is on a path to NATO membership, and the Bush administration is seeking to bring Georgia into NATO. And the reason why they didn't is, fortunately, there was an adult in the room, Mrs. Merkel, who said, no, absolutely not. So that was a well-known discussion in advance and caused a great deal of alarm in Moscow, as it would reasonably have done. And secondly, anyone who imagined that a Russian government would see Crimea with its naval base at Sevastopol come within the territory of a NATO ally without intervening if they could possibly was missing reality. They wouldn't accept that. They didn't accept that. They would predictably not accept that. And while I agree with John's characterization that what was happening in Ukraine in the period right before that was the Western Europeans, especially led, but with our support, of pulling NATO West into a close set of economic relations. In the calculations and in the discussion, their notion of them becoming an associate and then ultimately a member of the EU and in time a member of NATO was certainly on the table in the discussion, and somebody in Moscow would not have had to be paranoid to think that's where the matter is going, and I suspect that it might have done otherwise.
Okay,
Graham,
very
if I
good.
can add briefly, that would have meant that the Russians had to ignore the fact that, again, while I think that we should keep open the prospect of NATO membership for Ukraine, I don't see that as a near-term possibility. And the Russians have to understand where the Germans are, where the French are, where other allies are. I mean, this was simply not a realistic prospect. And the United States, this kind of decision has to be taken by the alliance by consensus. Whatever policy view you might have had in the United States, that was not going to change the situation. And I think the Russians were smart enough to understand that. This came down to really Ukraine's relationship with the European Union.
George,
we have a question here. Sorry, Paul, we don't have a lot of time left, so let me move on to another question. This one comes from Jacob Heilbrunn, who just so happens to be the editor of the National Interest. He asks about coronavirus, and I think we'd be remiss if we don't talk about that issue in the context of this specific debate. He says, John Pomfret argues in the Washington Post that both America and China, in bungling the coronavirus, have gravely damaged their reputations and power, forfeiting their respective claims to supremacy. Is he wrong? Graham.
Yes. Okay. You want more? Okay. So, again, Americans don't like to face reality. And there's no question that China made some big mistakes in the first inning in trying to confront coronavirus. But the hard facts about what's happening in China today is that Apple stores are not open in Washington. They're not open in New York. They're not open in Boston. They're open in China. The airport in Wuhan opened this week. People are flying from Wuhan to all over other cities in China and some internationally. So after having finally awakened to the threat, China's response, using measures that we find objectionable, and many of them are and wouldn't be appropriate for us, but nonetheless has made a significant impact. And actually, the Chinese, both in terms of their performance and then in terms of their very extensive support now to more than 80 countries in selling and sending assistance and medical equipment, have taken advantage of this in terms of the longer term rivalry and to support the narrative of an inevitably rising China and a declining US. On the other hand, I think we're all frustrated to the point of dismay about the American government's stumbling response to this in the first phase, in the second phase, and the third phase, in my view, continuing today. So it'll be impossible to think about, both domestically for the US and China, but also internationally, the standing and stature and confidence in each of these two countries and systems without having in mind this vivid experience. It's captured the imagination of people all over the world of coronavirus and who did what. Now, finally, I would say the good news about democracies is that they're very slow off the mark. We usually screw up and then we screw up again, but as Churchill said, we eventually come to the right answer. Initially in wars, if this is a war on coronavirus, if it was declared over at the end of the first quarter, we lose. So in the Revolutionary War, if it stopped in 1776, we lost. In the First World War, we didn't even arrive till the end. In World War II, Hitler had almost overrun Europe before we got there. So I would say don't count us out. I'm not counting us out, but unless and until we manage a response to this that will be as successful as China's, people will look at our system and look at their system and say, huh.
Okay, very good. Now, we have one more question I'd like to get in. We only have about 4 minutes left in this. This is from Mark Katz of George Mason University, and he raises the question of how do you regulate this kind of great power competition? He says, great power acceptance of one another's spheres of influence appears to be a way of limiting tension among them, but conceding a certain set of countries to an adversary may simply encourage it to expand its sphere of influence further, therefore increasing great power tension. Can this problem be avoided? Reactions?
Probably not.
Okay, Graham.
I think that the Cold War provides for us some lessons in this respect. The idea of living for 4 decades with captive nations whom an evil empire had occupied with their own troops and were ruling by puppet governments was an ugly, ugly, ugly reality. But as I argued before, one that we learned to live with because, or if lived with to a degree, if the alternative was to fight about it. And that didn't mean that we accepted the evil empire as good. It didn't mean that we approved of it. It didn't mean that we didn't continue competing in every way we could, indeed even trying to undermine it. And I think the Cold War strategy may offer some clues with respect to the competitions that we're engaged in these instances, in which on some items, for some time, one's got to live with an ugly reality, not applaud it, not approve of it, but to live with it as you compete in other arenas and hope over time either states evolve to a more enlightened point of view, or alternatively, as in the case of the Soviet Union, collapse.
As I said earlier, there seems to be a whiff of nostalgia for the Cold War in the air, which I don't think is really necessary. The reason why you had this strong Soviet presence in Eastern Europe for almost a half a century was because the Red Army was the most powerful army at the end of World War II. Russia is nowhere near as powerful today. Great power competition in spheres of influence means that the boundaries, the frontiers are always shifting. We should understand that. And we make sure we should use our advantages, both military, economic, and so on, to work things in Eastern Europe in our favor, which also has the advantage of being consistent with the wishes of the people of Eastern Europe.
Let me add one last point, which is I think a lot of what the Russians do, including in developing a sphere of influence, is driven by Russian domestic politics. If you go back to the 2000s, Vladimir Putin was content or said he did not object to NATO enlargement at a time when the Russian economy was growing and the Kremlin could base regime legitimacy on rising living standards. When Putin came back to the presidency in 2012, the economic situation was much more grim, and you saw him return to these themes of Russia as a great power, Russian nationalism. So a lot of Russia is doing in its neighborhood is not because of American policy, it's because of domestic situations and domestic politics within Russia.
All right, Steve, I commend you because you have answered just on the dot for our 3:30 closing point. So I commend all of the panelists. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. Thank you also to the audience. Obviously, we couldn't address all the questions that everyone had, but that simply tells me we have a lot of room for further continuation of this discussion.
I think our next debate, George, needs to be on who's responsible for Georgia and Ukraine.
Great.
I think that would be a lively one. Thank you so very much for joining us once again.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.